Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling a topic that's been sparking a lot of conversation lately. Um, Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
DEI.
Yeah, DEI. And it's been in the news a lot recently because President Trump just signed this executive order. And
It's a big one.
it is a big one,
Yep.
yeah. It basically dismantles DEI initiatives in the federal government and puts all those federal DEI workers on leave.
That's right. It's really caused a lot of debate about the whole point of DEI and where we're going with it these days.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today. We're going to deep dive into both sides of the argument, and we're going to be using this recent news segment that we saw as kind of our jumping off point because it really captured the strong feelings and different opinions people have about this.
Yeah, it's like we're getting right into the middle of the conversation, trying to understand what's really driving it.
Exactly. So this news segment we're talking about, it featured a lot of different voices, including the president of the National Urban League, who, didn't hold back. He straight up called this executive order an assault on DEI.
And it's important to understand why he feels that way. For many people, DEI isn't just some nice-to-have thing. It's about breaking down those systemic barriers that have prevented equal opportunity for everyone.
And in the news segment, they give this example of, expanding recruitment efforts to a wider range of schools.
Right.
I mean, that seems like it would fit under the DEI umbrella.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you're only looking for talent in a small group of elite schools, you're going to miss out on a ton of amazing people from all kinds of backgrounds. DEI is about recognizing that talent is everywhere and building a more inclusive environment where everyone can thrive.
It's like finding those hidden gems that might never get a chance if we don't broaden our search.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it forces us to confront our own biases, those assumptions we make about where talent should come from. It's about building a system that's based on merit and potential, not just where someone went to school or what they look like.
But then the news segment also featured those who are really critical of DEI programs. They say it's actually discriminatory and puts some groups, specifically white Americans, at a disadvantage.
Right. And this is where things get really complicated. Critics argue that when you focus on certain identity groups, you might unintentionally hurt others who feel like they're being overlooked because of their race or gender. It raises these big questions about reverse discrimination and whether these programs are really achieving fairness.
Yeah, it's a really sensitive issue. And to add to that, the news segment pointed out that some big companies like Walmart, Ford Motors, and John Deere are already scaling back their own DEI policies.
Right. And that's a really interesting detail because it shows that this debate isn't just happening in theory, it's having real-world consequences.
Yeah.
Companies are trying to figure out how to navigate this changing political and social climate around DEI.
Yeah, it's like everyone's watching to see what happens next.
Right? It could be like a domino effect. This change at the federal level could make other companies rethink or even roll back their own DEI stuff.
Yeah.
Like a whole shift in the rules.
So how would this actually affect, people like us? Would we feel it in our everyday lives?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but one place we might see a difference is in the workplace. If companies start easing up on DEI, it could mean fewer opportunities for underrepresented groups to move up, especially into leadership roles.
Wow. So less diversity at the top, that could have a huge impact.
It could. And this whole thing, it taps into this tension we have in our society, this desire for everyone to have an equal shot, but also this fear that focusing too much on identity could divide us.
Right. Like we're trying to make things right without making new problems.
Exactly. And there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
The challenge is figuring out how to create a system that acknowledges those systemic disadvantages, but also makes sure people are judged based on merit and what they can do.
So it's not just one thing, it's like a whole bunch of factors.
Right. And this debate isn't going away. It's tied to our history, our values, and how we see a truly equitable society.
It feels like we're in the middle of a really important conversation.
We are. So where do we go from here? What can we do to make this conversation better?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I think the first step is to really try to understand different perspectives. It's easy to get caught up in the arguments, but we need to remember that behind every opinion, there's a person with their own experiences.
Yeah, that makes sense. It goes back to what we were talking about before, finding that balance between recognizing individual merit and addressing systemic inequalities.
Exactly. It's not about choosing one or the other. It's about recognizing that both matter, individual effort, and systemic barriers both shape where people end up. The challenge is to create a system that takes both into account, a system that's fair.
So basically, we're in this complex situation with strong opinions on all sides.
Yeah.
And we need to be thoughtful and really try to understand the whole picture.
Absolutely. And we need to have these conversations with open minds and be willing to learn from each other and recognize that there are lots of different viewpoints.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole DEI thing.
Yeah, and that's what these deep dives are all about, you know? You start digging into one thing and it leads to a whole web of connected issues.
Right. We need to look at the history and the current situation and what it all means for the future.
Exactly.
And we've talked about the arguments, the worries people have, even how companies are reacting to this executive order. But what about the long-term effects? How could this change the future of diversity and inclusion, not just now, but years from now?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's tough to predict the future, for sure, but we can think about some possibilities.
Okay. Yeah. Let's do that. What are some things that could happen?
Well, on one hand, this could be a big step backward for people who support DEI. It might make it harder to push for inclusive policies, especially if there's resistance. We could see progress slowing down.
That's kind of a bummer. But yeah, I can see that happening. Is there a chance something good could come out of this?
Maybe. This executive order, even though it's controversial, could make us have a deeper, more thoughtful conversation about DEI. It could force us to really examine our assumptions and figure out what we're trying to achieve and come up with better strategies.
So this whole shakeup could actually lead to some positive change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need something to disrupt the status quo to create real change.
I like that perspective. It reminds us that even when things seem bad, there's always hope and a chance to learn and grow.
For sure. And the conversation about DEI isn't over.
Mm.
We need to stay engaged,
Yeah.
learn as much as we can, and keep working towards a more inclusive world.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I understand this executive order and what it can mean so much better now.
That's what we're here for, to help make things clearer and give you the context to understand the issues that are shaping our world.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've discussed how this executive order might affect things, but the real impact depends on how each of us chooses to respond as individuals, as organizations, and as a society. It's a challenge to all of us to think critically about how we can build a more inclusive future.
Well said. We all have a role to play in this conversation, and our choices make a difference.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of DEI. Until next time.